The rise of shadows. The night sky glowed red above Rome. Flames licked the heavens, turning marble palaces into smoking ruins, while screams echoed through the streets. The Eternal City, the heart of an empire that once ruled the known world, was being torn apart, and for the first time in nearly 800 years, the unthinkable had happened. Rome was burning, and its enemies were inside her gates. But this was not the beginning of the story. This was the shadow of its end. Torches flickered in the hands of the invaders. The Visigoths poured through the streets like a flood of vengeance, kicking down doors, ripping treasures from temples, dragging Roman citizens into the night. The mighty empire that had once called itself invincible now trembled like a dying giant. How had the greatest power on earth fallen to this moment of chaos? The answer lay far in the past, in the city's own beginnings, where its glory had been forged alongside its destruction. To understand the fall, we must travel back to the rise. Rome did not begin as marble columns and mighty legions. It began as a cluster of huts on 7 hills, a humble village born out of survival. The Romans were not gods, not kings, but men hardened by hunger, war, and ambition. They would claw their way from obscurity to dominance, one battle, one betrayal, one conquest at a time. And already, within that rise, seeds of ruin were being planted. Legend says 2 brothers, Romulus and Remus, raised by a she-wolf, fought for power. Romulus struck down his brother and named the city after himself, Rome. It was a beginning written in blood, a beginning that carried an omen. Rome would rise through violence, and violence would one day consume it. Even in its birth, Rome was both promise and curse. The question was never if it would fall, but when. The first Romans were survivors, a people of cunning and steel. Surrounded by enemies, they built walls of discipline and unity. Their strength was not in wealth, not yet, but in a spirit that refused defeat. They fought off tribes, absorbed them, learned from them. Every loss became a lesson, every victory a step higher. But every step up meant a harder fall waiting at the top. As Rome grew, so did its hunger. It devoured neighboring lands, binding conquered peoples with roads, laws, and fear. Farmers became soldiers, soldiers became conquerors, and conquerors became masters of nations. Yet each victory filled Rome with both pride and arrogance. The greater the empire, the more cracks it hid beneath its golden surface. The Romans believed their destiny was written by the gods. They marched under banners that declared them chosen, eternal, unstoppable. Their legions thundered across mountains and seas, crushing armies, enslaving nations. But what happens when mortals believe themselves divine? That belief gave them strength, but it also blinded them. No empire is eternal, and every empire has enemies waiting in the shadows. The Senate rose, filled with powerful men who ruled with ambition sharper than any sword. Republic, they called it. Shared power, shared rule. Yet ambition never truly shares. Political rivalry simmered in those chambers, and while the Republic expanded outward, inside, it began to rot. Rome's greatness was a storm gathering strength, but storms do not last forever. Generals became heroes, heroes became legends, and legends became threats to the Senate itself. Men like Julius Caesar, who rose not just as a soldier, but as a symbol of Rome's unstoppable force. His ambition shook the Republic to its core, and when blood spilled on the floor of the Senate, Rome crossed a line it could never return from. The Republic died in violence, and an empire was born. Caesar's murder was meant to save Rome, but instead it crowned emperors. Power no longer belonged to the people or the Senate, but to men who ruled like gods. The age of emperors began with Augustus, Caesar's heir, and it would last for centuries. Yet each emperor, whether wise or cruel, pushed Rome further toward both greatness and doom. Augustus brought peace, a golden age of prosperity. Roads stretched like veins across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Trade, culture, and wealth poured in, making Rome the heart of the known world. The people rejoiced, believing the empire eternal. But peace can soften steel, and prosperity can weaken discipline. Shadows were already stirring beyond the empire's borders. The legions stood watch at the edges of the empire, facing barbarians who were not yet strong enough to challenge Rome. But time changes everything. Each year, those tribes grew larger, bolder, hungrier, and within Rome itself, whispers of corruption and greed began to spread. For every emperor who ruled with wisdom, another ruled with madness, cruelty, or weakness. The empire became a stage for spectacle. Gladiators fought to the death for the crowd's amusement. Wealth flowed into palaces while peasants begged in the streets. Rome, so proud of its discipline and virtue, was losing itself to excess. A golden empire glittered on the outside but cracked within. The stronger it seemed, the more fragile it became. Enemies outside sharpened their blades, but the deadliest enemy was inside. Civil wars erupted. Emperors were overthrown, assassinated, replaced. The throne of Rome became a seat of blood, each ruler more desperate to hold power than the last. The empire was a beast devouring itself, even as it pretended to roar in glory. And so we return to that night, the flames rising in 410 CE. Alaric and his Visigoths stormed the Eternal City, not as savages, but as conquerors who had once served Rome and been betrayed. The empire that had enslaved nations now bowed to the very barbarians it once mocked. It was not just a city that burned, it was the illusion of Rome's immortality. But Rome's fall did not happen in one night. No, it was a slow collapse, stretched across centuries of pride, ambition, and betrayal. From its rise on the blood of brothers to the fire of Alaric's invasion, every moment was a step on a doomed path. Each victory carved the road to downfall. Each emperor carried both torch and dagger. This is the story of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, a tale of glory and ruin, of men who believed themselves gods, of cities that thought themselves eternal. It is a story filled with battles, betrayals, triumphs, and tragedies that shaped the world forever. And at every turn, suspense lingers. When will the empire finally break? The flames of 410 C are only the beginning of the end. Ahead lies the tale of emperors drunk on power, of legions lost in faraway lands, of enemies who would not be stopped, and of a city that forgot its own warnings. The rise was magnificent, the fall was inevitable, and the shadows that swallowed Rome wait to be told. Will you follow them into the heart of the empire's triumph and tragedy? The rise of the Republic, the fire that burned in Rome's future, began with something extraordinary in its past: the birth of the Republic. It was not built overnight. nor by accident. It rose from rebellion, from the courage of a people who refused to be ruled by kings. Long before Rome crowned emperors, it wore the chains of monarchy, and it was in breaking those chains that Rome first discovered its true power. But freedom always comes with a price, and Rome would pay it in blood. In the early days, Rome was ruled by kings. They wore crowns, held absolute power, and demanded loyalty. For a time, the people obeyed. But kings grow greedy, and absolute power corrupts. The last king, Tarquin the Proud, ruled not with wisdom, but with fear. His cruelty became unbearable, and the people of Rome, led by brave nobles, rose up against him. In the smoke of revolt, monarchy fell, and something new was born. They called it the Republic. Power would no longer rest in the hands of one man, but would be shared among the Senate, the magistrates, and the people. It was an experiment unlike any the world had seen before. Could men rule themselves without kings, without tyrants? The Romans believed they could, and in that belief, they laid the foundation for an empire that would one day dominate the world. Yet hidden inside that dream was a shadow, the ambition of men who would one day try to seize it all back. The Senate became the heartbeat of the Republic. Senators, chosen from Rome's most powerful families, debated, argued, and decided the fate of the city. They claimed to serve the people, but power attracts ambition, like fire attracts moths. The Senate would become both Rome's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. Every law it passed, every war it declared would shape the empire to come, and every betrayal within it would one day bring Rome to its knees. The people, too, demanded their place. Rome was divided between patricians, the wealthy elite, and plebeians, the common citizens. The plebeians refused to remain voiceless. They demanded rights, demanded representation, and threatened to abandon the city if ignored. Their struggle for equality would echo through centuries of Roman history. It gave strength to the Republic, but it also planted seeds of conflict that would never truly fade. Rome learned quickly that survival required strength. Surrounded by enemies, the young republic built its army, not as a tool of kings, but as a shield of citizens. Every man who fought for Rome fought for his home, his family, his freedom. The legions were not yet professional soldiers, they were farmers, craftsmen, ordinary men turned warriors. And in that unity lay a terrifying strength. Rome fought as one, and Rome rarely lost. But Rome's neighbors tested it again and again. The Etruscans, once their rulers, sought to crush the Republic. The Latins, rivals on the Italian peninsula, challenged their dominance. Rome fought them all, and Rome won. Each victory expanded its territory. Each conquest brought new allies and new enemies. The Republic was no longer just surviving, it was expanding. And expansion would become its obsession. With victory came pride, and with pride came ambition. Rome began weaving alliances, demanding loyalty from conquered peoples, creating a web of control across Italy. But control breeds resentment. Not everyone wanted to be ruled by Rome, and rebellions smoldered like embers. Rome crushed them ruthlessly, teaching the world that betrayal would be punished with blood. Yet with every rebellion, Rome became harsher, colder, and more dangerous. It was not enough to rule Italy. Rome's eyes turned outward, toward the rich lands beyond the sea. And across that sea lay Carthage, a mighty power with fleets that ruled the Mediterranean. Rome and Carthage could not coexist. Their rivalry would ignite a conflict so great it would be remembered for centuries: the Punic Wars. In this clash, Rome would face its greatest threat yet, and prove just how far it was willing to go for power. The Punic Wars were not just battles, they were epics of blood and strategy. Hannibal, Carthage's greatest general, marched his army across the Alps with elephants, striking fear into the heart of Rome. Never before had the Republic faced such danger. Rome shook, but it did not fall. Again and again, Rome bled, but each time it rose stronger, more determined. The Republic would not be destroyed by Hannibal. It would learn from him, and it would become even more ruthless. When Rome finally defeated Carthage, it did not stop at victory. It annihilated the city. Carthage was burned to the ground, its people slaughtered or enslaved, its lands cursed so that nothing would grow again. This was Rome's message to the world: defy us, and we will erase you. But in that brutal triumph, something shifted. Rome was no longer just a republic of citizens defending their homes. It was an empire in all but name, hungry for more. The spoils of war poured into Rome. Wealth, slaves, and land flooded the republic. Senators grew richer, generals more powerful, and the gap between rich and poor widened. The republic that had been born in equality and shared rule began to fracture. The people cried out for justice, but the Senate grew deaf with arrogance. The foundations of Rome trembled, though few yet noticed the cracks. Those cracks widened as powerful generals began to see themselves as more than servants of the state. They commanded armies loyal not to the Senate, but to them personally. With wealth and soldiers at their backs, these men held the power to challenge the Republic itself. The very system Rome had built to prevent kings was giving birth to new ones in disguise. The Gracchus brothers tried to save Rome. They fought for land reform, for the rights of the poor, for justice in a republic drowning in greed. But the Senate crushed them, murdering both in cold blood. Their deaths were more than tragedy. They were a warning. Rome's leaders no longer debated with words. They ruled with daggers, and politics was becoming a battlefield. Civil wars followed, tearing Rome apart from within. Generals like Marius and Sulla turned their armies against the city they were meant to protect. The streets of Rome ran with Roman blood, and each conflict left scars that could not be healed. The Republic was strong, but not unbreakable. With every civil war, it lost a piece of itself. And then came Julius Caesar. Brilliant, fearless, and ambitious beyond measure, he conquered Gaul and returned to Rome with legions that worshipped him as a god. The Senate feared him, but the people adored him. He crossed the Rubicon River with his army, defying the Republic itself, and in that moment, the die was cast. Rome could never go back. Caesar seized power, not as king, but as dictator. He ruled with vision and strength, but also with ambition that threatened the Senate's very existence. And so, in the shadows of the Senate chambers, daggers were drawn. On the Ides of March, Caesar fell beneath the blades of men who called themselves saviors of the Republic. But in truth, they had only doomed it. The Republic died with Caesar's blood. His death did not save it, it destroyed it. Civil wars erupted once more, and Rome would soon crown its first emperor. The experiment of shared rule had ended in betrayal and chaos. From now on, Rome would belong to emperors, for better and for worse. The Republic had risen from rebellion and conquered the world, but in doing so, it had lost its soul. The same ambition that built it had torn it apart. Its story is one of brilliance and blood, freedom and betrayal. And yet, even in its fall, Rome was not done rising. The empire was coming, and with it, both glory and ruin. As the Republic fell into shadow, the stage was set for an age of emperors, men who would rise like gods and fall like mortals, dragging Rome with them. The story was far from over. The greatest chapters, filled with triumph and tragedy, had yet to unfold. And already, in the smoke of Caesar's murder, the future of Rome burned with both promise and doom. The age of emperors, Augustus, and the Golden Dawn, the Republic lay broken, its streets scarred by civil war and betrayal. Julius Caesar's murder had not saved it, it had only unleashed chaos. Rome bled as generals fought for control. Armies clashed in the fields, and the dream of freedom died in smoke and steel. Out of this storm rose one man, quiet at first, but destined to reshape Rome forever. His name was Octavian, but the world would remember him as Augustus. Octavian was Caesar's adopted heir, a boy of cunning mind and iron will. At first, few believed he could survive against Rome's seasoned generals. Yet step by step, with patience sharper than any blade, he outmaneuvered them all. With alliances, betrayals, and bloody battles, he rose higher until only one rival remained, Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend turned enemy, whose love for Cleopatra bound him to Egypt's throne. The clash between Octavian and Antony was more than a war of men, it was a war for Rome's soul. At the Battle of Actium, sails filled the sea, and the thunder of oars carried the fate of the empire. Octavian's fleet crushed Antony and Cleopatra, and with their defeat, the last obstacle to power fell. Rome had found its new master. When Octavian returned to Rome, he did not call himself king. He knew the people hated kings. Instead, he called himself princeps, the first citizen. But in truth, he ruled with absolute power. The Senate bowed, the legions obeyed, and the empire was born. Octavian took a new name, a name of reverence, Augustus. Augustus brought peace to Rome, a peace the world had never seen before. The civil wars ended, the legions stood victorious across the known world, and prosperity flooded into the city. This era would be called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, and for 200 years it would be Rome's golden age. Yet even in peace, shadows gathered at the edges, waiting for the right moment to strike. Rome became a city of marble. Temples rose toward the sky. Aqueducts carried water across miles of land, and roads stretched outward like veins, binding provinces together. To the people, Augustus was no tyrant, he was a savior. But beneath the beauty and order, Augustus ruled with careful control. Bread and circuses kept the masses happy, while spies and soldiers ensured silence from dissenters. The legions became Rome's iron fist. Stationed across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, they guarded the empire's vast borders. Each soldier was disciplined, loyal, and deadly. Their presence meant that rebellion was crushed before it began. Rome's enemies trembled at the sound of marching boots. But the bigger the empire grew, the harder it became to hold together. Augustus also reformed the Senate, giving it dignity but not real power. Senators debated, argued, and plotted, but their voices were hollow. Real decisions were made by Augustus. The Republic was a memory, dressed in the costume of tradition, but its spirit was dead. And though Augustus promised stability, he also built a system where one man's failure could doom an entire empire. Not all accepted this new world. Some whispered that Rome had traded freedom for comfort, that the Republic had died so people could feast in arenas and cheer at games. But their voices were drowned out by roaring crowds, drunk on glory and spectacle. Augustus had given Rome peace, but peace born of obedience. And obedience, once broken, could turn into chaos again. Still, for most Romans, this was an age of triumph. The empire stretched from Spain to Syria, from Britain to Egypt. Gold and grain flowed into the capital. The people feasted, celebrated, and believed the empire eternal. Yet eternity is an illusion, and in every golden age lies the shadow of its own destruction. Augustus reigned for decades, guiding Rome with steady hands. But he was mortal. As he grew old, one question haunted the empire: who would rule after him? Succession, once the duty of elections, was now a game of bloodlines and ambition. With Augustus's death came a dangerous truth. Rome's fate would forever depend on the character of its emperors. Some emperors would be wise, others cruel. Some would build Rome higher, others would drag it into ruin. Each new ruler held the empire's destiny in his grip, and the throne of Rome became the most dangerous seat in the world, a prize worth killing for, and a curse worth dying from. Tiberius followed Augustus, a general of grim discipline but little joy. Under him, Rome's peace continued, yet the cracks widened. Corruption grew, whispers of treason spread, and the throne became a shadowed place of suspicion. Still, the empire endured, stronger than any single man. But the emperors to come would test that strength. Then came Caligula. At first, the people rejoiced at his reign, but madness soon revealed itself. He demanded to be worshipped as a living god. He wasted fortunes on spectacles, humiliated senators, and ruled with cruelty disguised as amusement. The empire that had once been proud of discipline now trembled under the whim of a mad emperor. Rome was learning that its golden crown could also be a noose. Caligula's reign ended in blood, assassinated by his own guards. But his madness had already scarred the empire. Rome realized the danger of emperors who ruled not for the people, but for themselves. Yet still, the system stood. Emperors came and went, each leaving their mark on Rome's destiny. Claudius followed, a man underestimated as weak, but who proved shrewd and capable. Under him, Rome conquered Britain, expanding the empire to its furthest edge. Yet even Claudius met betrayal. Poison ended his reign, likely at the hands of his own wife. The empire's throne was a stage for ambition, and few emperors left it alive. And then Nero. His name would echo through history as one of Rome's darkest rulers. He fancied himself an artist, a poet, even as he drained the empire's wealth for his vanity. When fire ravaged Rome, whispers claimed he had watched it burn while playing music. Whether true or not, the image of Nero laughing as the city burned became a symbol of the empire's corruption. Nero's cruelty grew unbearable. Senators conspired, generals rebelled, and even the people turned against him. At last, hunted and abandoned, Nero took his own life. With his death, the Julio-Claudian line, the family of Augustus, ended in chaos. The empire, once built on promises of peace, now faced a terrifying question. Could it survive without the blood of its founder? What followed was the Year of the Four Emperors, a year of civil war, where rival generals fought for the throne. Rome tore itself apart again, until finally one victor emerged, Vespasian. He restored stability, rebuilt the city, and proved that the empire could outlive even madness. But the lesson was clear. Rome's greatest threat was not enemies at its borders. It was the men who wore the crown. The age of Augustus had promised eternal peace. But as emperors rose and fell, the truth became clear. Rome's destiny hung by a thread. Its golden age glittered with triumph, but beneath the shine lay shadows, ambition, betrayal, madness. The empire had risen to heights no one had imagined, but every height casts a deeper fall. And the fall was coming. The glory of Rome, expansion and power at its peak, the empire that Augustus built and his successors fought to hold together, soon reached heights no one could have imagined. From the sands of the Sahara to the misty forests of Britain, from the Atlantic Ocean to the deserts of Mesopotamia, Rome's banners flew. At its peak, the Roman Empire was the greatest power the world had ever seen. But history teaches us that what climbs highest also falls hardest. Under Emperor Trajan, Rome expanded further than ever before. His legions marched east, crushing enemies and seizing lands that filled the empire's coffers with wealth. In victory, Rome claimed Dacia, modern-day Romania, rich with gold mines that would fuel the empire's prosperity. Yet even as the empire swelled with riches, it also grew heavier, harder to control, and more fragile. Trajan was hailed as Optimus Princeps, the best ruler. He was a soldier's emperor, marching alongside his legions, sharing their hardships, winning their loyalty. To the people, he was a hero. To the Senate, he was a strong hand that kept order. Under his rule, Rome was unstoppable. And yet, hidden beneath the triumph, shadows whispered. No empire can stretch forever without tearing at its edges. Rome's roads stretched like veins across continents, binding cities together. Aqueducts carried water into great metropolises, and amphitheaters roared with the cheers of thousands. Everywhere Rome went, it left its mark, temples, forums, and laws that would outlast the empire itself. But every new province meant more soldiers, more taxes, more resentment from conquered peoples. The empire was vast, but vastness is a burden as much as it is a crown. Trajan's conquests brought glory, but they also brought enemies closer. At the empire's borders, restless tribes watched and waited. The Parthians, fierce rivals in the east, struck back. Rome had reached its limit, and pushing further only strained its strength. The empire's glory gleamed like gold in sunlight, but gold can be heavy, and too much weight can break even the strongest stone. After Trajan's death, his adopted heir, Hadrian, took the throne. Unlike Trajan, Hadrian was not a conqueror, but a protector. He knew Rome could not expand forever. Instead, he built walls. In Britain, his soldiers raised Hadrian's Wall, a mighty barrier stretching across the island, keeping the northern tribes at bay. It was a symbol of strength, but also a fear. Rome, for the first time, admitted it needed to defend itself. Hadrian traveled across the empire, inspecting cities, strengthening borders, and uniting a realm so vast it seemed impossible for one man to rule. He built monuments, reformed laws, and brought stability. Yet his walls told a different story. The empire had stopped growing, and when empires stop growing, they begin to age. Rome's golden dawn was already bending toward dusk. The empire's might was not just in its armies, but in its culture. Roman law shaped provinces. Roman roads carried ideas as much as soldiers, and Roman architecture left cities gleaming. To many, being conquered by Rome meant not slavery, but civilization. Yet for others, it meant oppression, taxes, and a constant reminder that freedom had been stolen. Rome's glory was never free. Someone always paid the price. Wealth flowed endlessly into Rome. Senators lived in luxury, emperors in palaces, and the people feasted on grain imported from Egypt. But luxury breeds weakness. Citizens who once fought as soldiers now relied on mercenaries and slaves. The discipline that had built the empire softened into decadence. And decadence, once rooted, is almost impossible to pull out. Still, the people worshiped their emperors. They filled the Colosseum to watch gladiators fight and die, screaming with joy as blood painted the sand. Bread and circuses kept them entertained, distracted from politics and corruption. Rome gave its people everything: food, games, beauty, but in exchange, it took their vigilance. And without vigilance, empires decay in silence. The legions remained the empire's shield, but even they felt the strain. Guarding frontiers thousands of miles long, facing enemies on every border, they became stretched thin. When wars erupted in the east, defenses in the west weakened. When barbarians attacked in the north, the east was left exposed. The empire was a giant, but even giants stumble when pulled in every direction. Some emperors, like Antoninus Pius, brought peace and prosperity. Others, like Marcus Aurelius, fought tirelessly to defend the empire from endless invasions. Marcus, the philosopher king, wrote of wisdom and duty even as he faced wars that drained Rome's strength. His reign was noble, but when he died, he left the throne to his son, Commodus, and with Commodus, the shadows crept closer. Commodus was no philosopher, no soldier. He fancied himself a gladiator, strutting in the arena as the people cheered. He neglected the empire's borders, ignored the Senate, and bled Rome's treasury for his vanity. Under him, the empire trembled. For the first time since Augustus, the people feared the throne itself more than Rome's enemies. When Commodus was assassinated, chaos erupted. Rome entered a period of instability known as the Year of the Five Emperors, where generals and usurpers clawed for power. Civil war returned, and with it, Rome's strength faltered. The empire had been built on order and discipline, but now disorder reigned. The Golden Age was dimming, and the shadows grew longer. Yet even in chaos, Rome endured. Strong emperors like Septimius Severus rose, holding the empire together with iron fists. His dynasty brought temporary stability, but it relied on fear and military might. The Senate was powerless, the people restless, and the legions weary. The empire stood, but it stood on fragile ground. Rome's borders became rivers of blood. Germanic tribes pressed harder in the north. The Persians rose again in the east. Rebellion sparked in distant provinces. Each victory cost more lives, more gold, more strength. The empire that had once expanded without end now fought desperately to keep what it already held. Inside the empire, corruption rotted the core. Governors exploited provinces, senators schemed for wealth, and emperors demanded loyalty bought with coin instead of respect. Soldiers sold their allegiance to the highest bidder, and the empire's unity weakened. The world saw Rome as invincible, but within, it was sickening. And yet, the illusion of glory remained. Rome's monuments still stood, its armies still marched, its citizens still cheered in arenas. To the outside world, it was eternal, unshakable. But illusions cannot last forever. Beneath the marble, cracks spread like veins of doom. At its height, Rome controlled the fate of millions. It was the heart of the ancient world, a beacon of power and culture. But every empire has a breaking point. And for Rome, that breaking point was approaching, faster than anyone dared admit. The golden crown was slipping. The glory of Rome was dazzling, but it blinded its people to the truth. An empire that once conquered the world now fought to hold it. The borders trembled, the throne grew unstable, and corruption seeped into every corner. The greatest empire in history stood tall, but even as it towered, the ground beneath it was crumbling. The fall was coming, and it would shake the world forever. The shadows within, corruption, madness, and civil wars. Rome's golden crown was shining still, but beneath it, the empire was bleeding from within. The greatest enemy was no longer Carthage, no longer the barbarian tribes at the borders, but Rome itself. Corruption spread like poison, madness sat upon the throne, and civil wars became as common as festivals. The eternal city was becoming its own executioner. The emperors who followed Marcus Aurelius carried more ambition than wisdom. Commodus had already shaken the empire with vanity and neglect, and his assassination opened a door Rome could never close. Now, generals marched their legions not against foreign enemies, but against each other, each declaring himself emperor. Rome, once united, tore itself apart with Roman blood. The year of the 5 emperors had shown how fragile the throne had become. But worse was yet to come. Soon, there would be a year of 20 emperors, each rising and falling like sparks in a firestorm. The legions, once loyal to the empire itself, became mercenaries loyal only to the commanders who paid them. The empire was for sale, and power belonged to the highest bidder. Civil wars drained the treasury, shattered provinces, and left borders undefended. While Romans slaughtered one another, barbarians crept into weakened frontiers. Enemies that had once trembled before the eagle of Rome now grew bolder, sensing weakness. For the first time in centuries, Rome's supremacy was in question. Inside the city, corruption rotted every level of power. Senators schemed for wealth, governors exploited provinces, and emperors drowned themselves in luxury while citizens starved. The empire that had once prided itself on discipline and order now feasted on excess. Bread and circuses distracted the people, but distractions cannot hide decay forever. Some emperors tried to restore order. Septimius Severus strengthened the army and gave the throne stability, but it came at a cost. He raised taxes, drained the treasury, and left his successors a fragile peace balanced on the loyalty of soldiers. His warning to his sons was chilling: enrich the soldiers and scorn all others. That advice kept Rome alive, but it also sealed its doom. When emperors bought loyalty with gold, soldiers fought for wealth, not for Rome. Generals became kingmakers, raising and toppling emperors at will. The throne of the Caesars, once seen as divine, became a prize to be stolen, defended, and lost in the chaos of civil war. The 3rd century became an age of shadows. In just 50 years, more than 24 emperors ruled, most of them dying violently. Some were assassinated by rivals, others betrayed by their own soldiers, others executed after losing battles. Rome had created an empire of emperors, but it could no longer control the storm it had unleashed. The people of Rome watched with weary eyes. Once proud citizens of a mighty empire, they now lived in fear of change. Each new emperor promised stability. Each new ruler swore Rome would rise again. But promises were drowned in blood, and hope turned into silence. The eternal city was losing faith in itself. While the empire tore itself apart, new threats grew stronger at the edges. Germanic tribes pressed against the Rhine and Danube. The Persians, reborn as the Sassanid Empire, struck deep into Roman lands, humiliating emperors in battle. One emperor, Valerian, was captured alive by the Persians, forced to kneel as a human step for their king. Rome, the master of nations, was now mocked as a slave. The shame of Valerian's capture echoed across the empire. How could the invincible Rome be humiliated so easily? Fear spread like wildfire. Provinces rebelled, armies deserted, and rivals declared themselves emperors of breakaway states. For a time, the empire itself fractured, 3 Romes existing at once, each claiming to be the true heir of Augustus. And yet, even in this chaos, flickers of strength remained. Aurelian, a soldier emperor, rose from the ashes and reunited the empire through ruthless campaigns. He defeated rebels, crushed enemies, and restored Rome's borders. They called him Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. But even his strength could not erase the truth. Rome was crumbling faster than it could be rebuilt. Each time an emperor restored order, his death reopened the wound. No system of succession held, no balance of power lasted. The Senate was powerless, the people voiceless, and the army treacherous. Rome had created a throne of gold, but that throne sat on a pit of daggers. Madness too often wore the crown. Some emperors drowned in paranoia, seeing assassins in every shadow. Others indulged in cruelty, killing allies as quickly as enemies. Rome's fate no longer rested in the strength of its people, but in the fragile mind of whichever man wore the purple robe. The stronger the empire had become, the more dangerous its throne now was. The cycle repeated. Power seized, power lost, blood spilled. Each civil war weakened Rome a little more. Each betrayal cut deeper. The empire survived, but survival came at a terrible cost. Provinces grew restless, enemies gathered strength, and the treasury grew empty. Rome was like a wounded lion, still feared, but bleeding slowly to death. Even religion began to shift in these dark years. Old gods, once worshipped with pride, seemed silent as Rome suffered defeat after defeat. New faiths, mysterious and powerful, spread through the empire. whispering of salvation beyond Rome's walls. Among them was Christianity, a faith that would one day rise to challenge the empire itself. The 3rd century crisis revealed the truth. Rome was not eternal. It could bleed, it could fracture, it could fall into madness. And though emperors like Aurelian and Diocletian would bring order for a time, the empire was no longer invincible. It was surviving, not thriving. Its enemies saw this. Its people felt it. Its rulers feared it. Rome had always believed its downfall would come from outside, from barbarians or foreign kings. But the true danger was inside, in the hearts of men who sought power above all else. The empire was not collapsing because of what others did to it. It was collapsing because of what it had done to itself. The shadows within Rome had grown too deep to ignore. Corruption, civil war, madness, betrayal, these were the wounds that weakened the empire more than any foreign invasion. Rome still stood, but it stood on legs of clay. And everyone who looked upon it knew that one strong push could send it crashing down. The greatest empire in history had become its own worst enemy. The rise had been glorious, the peak dazzling, but now the fall was unfolding. Civil wars had shown the cracks, madness had widened them, and corruption had poisoned the heart. The barbarians were watching, waiting, sharpening their swords. And soon, Rome's enemies would strike with deadly precision. The turning tide, Constantine, Christianity, and the divided empire, the empire staggered into the 4th century scarred but alive. Civil wars, invasions, and betrayals had nearly shattered it, yet Rome refused to die. Like a wounded beast, it rose again and again, held together by sheer will and the blood of countless soldiers. But change was in the air, change that would alter Rome's soul forever. From the chaos of the 3rd century emerged Diocletian, a soldier emperor who understood that Rome was too vast for one man to rule. His solution was bold: divide the empire into 2 halves, east and west, each ruled by an emperor. For the first time, Rome admitted what it had long denied: the empire was too large to control from a single throne. Diocletian's reforms brought stability, but his system also planted danger. 2 emperors meant 2 sources of ambition, 2 seats of rivalry. While Rome survived under his careful balance, the question loomed: what would happen when one emperor sought to be greater than the other? Balance can save, but balance can also break. And then came Constantine. His rise was marked by blood and battle, another in the long line of generals who seized power through war. But Constantine was no ordinary emperor. He carried a vision, one that would reshape the empire not only in politics, but in faith, culture, and destiny itself. On the eve of battle against his rival Maxentius, Constantine claimed to see a vision in the sky, a cross of light with words that promised victory. In this sign, you will conquer. Whether miracle or myth, Constantine embraced it. He marched into war under the Christian symbol, and when he triumphed at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, the world changed forever. For centuries, Christians had been persecuted, their faith outlawed, their followers executed in arenas. But Constantine ended the persecution. With the Edict of Milan in 313 CE, he declared freedom of religion across the empire. Christianity, once hunted in shadows, now walked openly in sunlight. The gods of old still had temples, but a new faith was rising, one that would one day rule Rome itself. The empire trembled with this shift. Some rejoiced, others resisted. The old gods had built Rome's traditions, its temples, its festivals. To abandon them seemed to many like abandoning Rome itself. But Constantine's decision could not be undone. The empire's heart was changing, and so too was its destiny. Constantine's reforms did not stop with religion. He also made a decision that shook the very foundations of Rome. The Eternal City, once the heart of the empire, was no longer the emperor's seat of power. Constantine built a new capital in the east, a city of shining marble and golden domes, Constantinople. Rome was no longer the center of its own empire. The choice was practical. The East was richer, safer, easier to defend. Constantinople stood at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, controlling trade and armies alike. But symbolically, it was devastating. The empire that had once called itself eternal had turned its back on its birthplace. The West was left weakened, abandoned, and vulnerable. Under Constantine, the empire thrived for a time. He strengthened the army, reformed taxes, and built cities. His reign was remembered as one of power and order. Yet the changes he made, Christianity's rise, Rome's eclipse, the permanent division of East and West, were cracks disguised as triumphs. What seemed like salvation was also the start of a new downfall. After Constantine's death, his successors inherited not a unified Rome, but a divided one. Sons and nephews fought for power, civil wars erupted once more, and the fragile peace broke apart. Christianity, now favored, became not only a faith, but a weapon in politics. Emperors used it to legitimize power, bishops used it to challenge rulers, and the old gods faded into silence. The empire was no longer one people, one faith, one destiny. The East grew stronger, wealthy with trade, fortified with walls. The West grew weaker, drained by invasions, corruption, and neglect. Rome, once a city that ruled the world, now watched as its strength slipped into the hands of another city far away. The Christian church grew in power, spreading across provinces, converting hearts, and shaping laws. Bishops held sway over emperors, and faith became as vital as swords. But faith also brought division. Debates over belief split Christians themselves, creating rifts that shook the empire as much as any enemy. Unity gave way to argument, and argument gave way to strife. Even as faith spread, enemies grew closer. The Goths, Vandals, and Huns pressed against the empire's borders with greater force than ever before. The East, shielded by Constantinople, stood firm. But the West, stripped of wealth and armies, could barely hold its ground. The division that Diocletian had created and Constantine had embraced was now Rome's greatest weakness. The Senate in Rome grew powerless, a shadow of what it once had been. Emperors came and went, their power fragile, their lives shorter. Generals seized thrones, barbarian mercenaries filled the legions, and the people whispered that the empire's glory was gone. In the East, Constantinople gleamed. In the West, Rome decayed. And yet, the illusion of strength remained. Emperors still wore crowns, legions still marched, and monuments still stood. The empire was not yet dead, but the signs were clear. It was changing into something new, something less Roman, something fragile. The eternal city was eternal no more. The Christians saw hope in this transformation, believing Rome was reborn through faith. The old guard saw only ruin, the death of traditions that had made Rome mighty. Both were right, for in changing its heart, the empire gained new strength but lost its soul, and the cost of that exchange would soon be revealed. Constantine's vision had won him battles, but visions do not last forever. His heirs lacked his strength, and his reforms created fractures no sword could mend. The East and West were drifting apart like two halves of a broken shield, and when enemies struck, they would strike the weaker half. The empire had survived corruption, civil wars, and madness. But division was different. Division meant weakness. Division meant betrayal. Division meant that when the barbarians came, and they were coming, Rome would no longer stand united. The turning tide had come. Christianity rose, Constantinople gleamed, and the empire split in two. To some, it seemed a new dawn. To others, the beginning of the end. What lay ahead was darker still, invasions that would shatter the West, emperors who would fall like stones, and a city that would burn as the world watched. The fall was no longer a shadow on the horizon. It was coming closer, step by step. The barbarian storm, the invasions begin, the tide had turned. For centuries, Rome had pushed outward, conquering tribes, kingdoms, and empires. But now, the flow reversed. From forests, steppes, and rivers beyond Rome's borders, new enemies came pouring in. Goths, Vandals, Franks, and Huns, names once dismissed as mere barbarians, were now forces that could shake the very walls of the Eternal City. Rome's predators had become Rome's executioners. It began with the Goths. Driven westward by the terrifying advance of the Huns, they sought refuge inside Roman lands. Hungry, desperate, and broken, they begged for sanctuary across the Danube. The empire agreed, but corruption poisoned the mercy. Roman officials starved them, sold their children into slavery, and treated them like animals. Rage grew in the Goths' hearts, and mercy turned into rebellion. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, the Goths struck back with fury. Roman legions, proud and disciplined, faced them with confidence. But arrogance turned to horror as the Gothic cavalry thundered across the field, smashing Rome's lines, slaughtering soldiers, and killing Emperor Valens himself. The empire had not seen such a defeat in centuries. Adrianople was a warning. Rome could bleed, and Rome could die. The defeat at Adrianople shattered the illusion of invincibility. The legions that had once conquered the world were broken by tribes once considered primitive. Whispers spread across provinces. If Rome could fall in one battle, what else could fall? The fear that followed was worse than the defeat itself. In the years that followed, more tribes pressed into Rome's borders. The Franks and Alemanni carved into Gaul. The Vandals roamed Spain and Africa. The Goths, restless and relentless, moved deeper into Roman lands. Each tribe tested Rome, and each time the empire struggled to push them back. The great walls and roads that had once held nations together were now shaking. The Huns were the storm behind the storm. Fierce riders from the steppes, they swept into Europe like fire across dry grass. With speed and savagery, they crushed every tribe in their path, driving them like waves against Rome's borders. To the Romans, the Huns seemed less like men and more like demons on horseback, unstoppable and merciless. Trapped between Rome and the Huns, the tribes had no choice but to move inward. They poured into the empire, some as invaders, others as refugees. Rome, stretched thin and divided between east and west, could not hold them all. What had once been controlled borders now became open doors, and through those doors came Rome's downfall. In the west, emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed. Some were children, others puppets, others traitors. Real power often lay not in Rome, but in generals or even in barbarian mercenaries hired to protect the empire. Rome, once master of nations, now paid foreigners to defend its crumbling walls. But mercenaries fight for coin, not loyalty, and loyalty was in short supply. The Goths, still restless, found their leader in Alaric. Once a soldier in Rome's own armies, he had been denied honor and reward by the empire he served. His heart burned with vengeance. He led his people through Italy, demanding recognition, demanding land, demanding justice. When Rome refused, he turned his fury on the city itself. In 410 CE, the unthinkable happened. Alaric and his Goths breached the walls of Rome. The Eternal City, which had not fallen to foreign hands in nearly 800 years, was plundered. Temples were looted, homes burned, and citizens dragged into slavery. The world gasped in shock. Rome, the master of nations, had been humbled by the very people it had once enslaved. The sack of Rome sent tremors through the empire. To its enemies, it was proof that Rome could fall. To its citizens, it was a nightmare they could never forget. The city survived, but the illusion of eternity was broken forever. Rome was mortal, and mortality meant death was coming. The empire tried to recover, but its enemies did not wait. The Vandals sailed across the Mediterranean, striking North Africa, Rome's vital grain supply. Without African wheat, famine gripped the western provinces. The empire that had once fed the world could no longer feed itself. Hunger weakened what war had not yet destroyed. Meanwhile, the Huns grew stronger under a new leader, Attila. Called the Scourge of God, Attila commanded an army that moved like thunder, burning cities, slaughtering armies, and leaving ash in its wake. Even the Eastern Empire, rich and fortified, trembled before him, buying peace with gold. In the West, Rome had no gold left to buy survival. Rome did manage one desperate victory. At the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 CE, Roman forces allied with Germanic tribes to halt Attila's advance. It was a bloody, desperate fight, and Attila retreated. For a moment, Rome breathed again. But victories no longer saved the empire. They only delayed its death. When Attila died, the Huns fractured, but the damage was done. Rome had been drained of men, money, and hope. The West was a shell, its cities in ruin, its provinces slipping away. The East, shielded by Constantinople, still stood strong. But the West was staggering toward collapse. The Vandals, seeing weakness, struck again. In 455 CE, they stormed Rome itself, plundering the city for 2 long weeks. The word vandalism would echo through history as a reminder of their destruction. Rome, once proud and invincible, had now been sacked twice in less than half a century. Each time, the wounds cut deeper. By now, Rome no longer ruled the barbarians ruled Rome. Germanic generals commanded Roman armies. Barbarian warlords decided the fate of emperors. The empire that had once absorbed nations into its strength was now being devoured from the inside. The people looked to emperors for salvation, but the emperors were powerless, often children placed on the throne by stronger men. Real rulers were generals and warlords who cared nothing for Rome's legacy. The Eternal City had become a pawn in the games of outsiders. The storm was no longer on the horizon, it was here. Rome's borders were gone, its strength broken, its enemies inside its gates. The empire that had once called itself eternal now counted its years, waiting for the final blow that would end it forever. The barbarian storm had begun. Rome's fall was no longer a question of if, but when. And the final act of this tragedy was about to unfold, an act that would see the last emperor fall, and the Western Roman Empire vanish into history. The fall of the West, the last emperor the barbarian storm had battered Rome for decades, leaving it broken and bleeding. Provinces were lost, cities destroyed, and emperors replaced like pieces on a chessboard. The Eternal City still stood, but it was a shadow of itself, a relic clinging to life. Now, the time had come for the final act, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. By the mid-5th century, Rome no longer ruled the world. Its armies were thin, its coffers empty, its people starving. Once proud senators wandered through ruined streets, powerless to stop the decline. The empire that had once conquered nations now begged its own generals for survival, and many of those generals were no longer Roman. Barbarian leaders now held real power in the West. They commanded Rome's armies, decided its politics, and controlled its emperors. The throne of Caesar was no longer the seat of mighty rulers, it was a puppet's chair, handed to weak boys while stronger men pulled the strings. Among these puppet emperors was one who would become infamous not for his strength, but for being the last. His name was Romulus Augustulus, a child placed on the throne in 475 CE. He carried a name that echoed Rome's beginning, Romulus, its mythical founder, and Augustus, its first emperor. But fate is cruel, and his reign would not mark a new beginning. It would mark the end. The true power behind Romulus was not the boy himself, but his father, Orestes. A skilled general, Orestes had seized control of the Western court and placed his son on the throne as a figurehead. Rome had fallen so low that its emperor was a child, chosen for his name rather than his strength. It was a symbol of how far the empire had decayed. But even Orestes could not control the forces tearing the empire apart. Among his soldiers were Germanic mercenaries, men who fought for coin, not for loyalty. They demanded land in Italy as payment for their service. When Orestes refused, their fury ignited, and they found their leader in a man named Odoacer. Odoacer, a chieftain of barbarian warriors, had served Rome faithfully as a soldier. But now, betrayed and denied, he turned against the empire. His men rallied to his banner, and together they marched on Italy. Rome's defenses crumbled before them. Orestes was captured and executed, and the boy emperor, Romulus, was left helpless. In September of 476 CE, Odoacer entered Ravenna, the western capital. Romulus Augustulus, the last emperor of the West, was brought before him. No great battle, no dramatic siege, just the quiet surrender of a powerless boy. Odoacer spared his life, sending him into exile, a child emperor forgotten by history. And with that, the Western Roman Empire was gone. The Senate, once the proud heart of the Republic, now had no empire to serve. They sent the imperial insignia, the purple robe and golden diadem, to Constantinople, acknowledging the Eastern Emperor as the sole ruler of Rome. The West had fallen, leaving only the East to carry the empire's name. The fall of the West did not come with an explosion, but with a whisper. There was no final glorious battle, no heroic last stand. Instead, it ended with betrayal, surrender, and silence. An empire that had once ruled the known world dissolved into fragments, its crown taken by a barbarian king. For the people of Rome, the fall was both shocking and inevitable. They had watched their empire rot from within, torn apart by corruption and greed, weakened by endless wars, and devoured by invaders. The sack of Rome had already broken their illusions. The fall of 476 CE only confirmed what they already feared. Rome was no longer eternal. The western provinces, once Rome's jewels, now belonged to barbarians. Gaul to the Franks, Spain to the Visigoths, Africa to the Vandals, Italy to Odoacer. The empire had been carved apart like the corpse of a fallen giant. Yet in each fragment, pieces of Rome survived, its laws, its language, its culture, seeds that would grow into new kingdoms. The Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, still called itself Roman. To them, the fall of the West was not the end, but a shift of power. They claimed the legacy of Augustus and Caesar, and for 1,000 more years they would rule as the Byzantine Empire. But for the West, the dream of Rome was over. The boy emperor Romulus Augustus vanished into history, his fate uncertain. Some say he lived quietly in southern Italy, spared from violence. Others believe he faded into obscurity, his name remembered only as a symbol. The founder's name, Romulus, had marked Rome's birth. His name now marked its death. The fall of the West was not just the end of an empire. It was the end of an age. The ancient world closed its doors, and the Middle Ages began. Europe would never again see a power as vast, as disciplined, or as feared as Rome. What followed was darkness, chaos, and the slow birth of something new. But even in its death, Rome lived on. Its roads, its laws, its language, all survived in the kingdoms that replaced it. Latin became the root of new tongues. Roman law shaped justice for centuries. The dream of empire lived on in kings, popes, and conquerors who all called themselves heirs of Rome. Yet for the Romans of 476 CE, none of that mattered. They walked through ruined streets, hungry, frightened, and defeated. The eternal city had fallen, not in one night, but over centuries of slow decline. And now, the world they had known was gone. The barbarian king Odoacer ruled Italy, but even he did not claim the title of emperor. The age of emperors in the West was finished. The throne of Augustus, Caesar, and Constantine was empty. A chapter of history had closed, leaving behind silence and ash. The West had fallen, but the story of Rome was not over. In the East, Constantinople stood strong, carrying the empire's name for another 1,000 years. But the shadow of the fall haunted every emperor who ruled there. If the West could fall, so too could the East. The year 476 CE marked the end of the Western Roman Empire, a fall born not of one blow, but of centuries of pride, betrayal, and weakness. The eternal city had collapsed, and the world had changed forever. But history is never truly silent. Rome would live on in memory, in culture, in ambition. And in that memory, new empires would rise and fall. The Eastern Empire, survival and transformation. The West had fallen in silence, but the East still stood. In Constantinople, the golden city of Constantine, the Roman name lived on. To its rulers, there was no division. They were still the emperors of Rome, heirs of Augustus and Caesar. To the world, they were something different, the Byzantines. But they called themselves Romans, and for 1,000 years more, they carried the empire's torch. Constantinople was a marvel, protected by mighty walls, surrounded by water, and filled with wealth from trade. It was a city unlike any other. While Rome crumbled, Constantinople thrived. Its streets were lined with markets from east and west. Its churches gleamed with gold, and its people believed they were the true guardians of civilization. Yet even as they flourished, the memory of the West's fall haunted them. The Eastern emperors inherited more than power. They inherited fear. They knew the West had fallen because of corruption, division, and enemies. They vowed not to repeat those mistakes. Yet power is fragile, and men are flawed. Though the East survived longer, the shadows of decline still lingered within its walls. One man, Justinian, rose to revive Rome's glory. Crowned in the 6th century, he dreamed of reconquering the lost provinces of the West. His generals, Belisarius and Narses, marched with brilliance, reclaiming North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and even parts of Spain. For a moment, it seemed Rome had been reborn. But dreams are costly. Justinian's wars drained the treasury and weakened the empire's armies. While his conquests shone brightly, they faded quickly after his death. The West could not be restored. What remained were exhausted soldiers, empty coffers, and lands too far away to hold. Rome's ghost had been summoned, but it could not live again. Yet Justinian's legacy was not just in conquest. He built Hagia Sophia, the great church whose golden dome seemed to float in the heavens. He codified Roman law into the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law that would shape nations long after the empire's final fall. Though his empire's borders shrank after him, his vision left marks that endured for centuries. The Eastern Empire was not the Rome of old. Its language shifted from Latin to Greek. Its culture blended Roman tradition with Christian faith and Eastern influence. It was Roman, but transformed, a new empire rising from the ashes of the old. The world called it Byzantine, but it was still Rome in its heart. Faith became the empire's backbone. Christianity, once persecuted, now reigned supreme. Churches filled cities, bishops wielded power, and emperors claimed divine authority. But faith also brought conflict. Debates over doctrine split the empire, creating rivalries as bitter as any battlefield. Unity, so vital for survival, was always threatened by division. Enemies tested the East just as they had the West. Persians struck from the east, Slavs from the north, and Arabs from the deserts. Each enemy challenged Constantinople's might, but the city endured. Its walls were said to be unbreakable, its defenses unmatched. Where Rome had fallen, Constantinople held firm. The Arabs came with fire and faith, sweeping across the Middle East and North Africa. They threatened the empire's very existence, yet the walls of Constantinople turned them back. Greek fire, a weapon of flame that burned even on water, lit the seas with destruction, saving the city again and again. The empire lived, but at the cost of its Western dreams. The East survived not through endless conquest, but through resilience. Diplomacy, gold, and cunning became as vital as armies. The emperors of Constantinople learned to play enemies against each other, to buy peace when war was too costly, and to strike only when the time was right. Survival, not expansion, was their strength. And yet, within the empire, corruption and intrigue still thrived. Palaces echoed with whispers of betrayal, generals plotted against emperors, and emperors blinded rivals to keep the throne. The East was stronger than the West had been, but it was no stranger to the poison of ambition. The people of Constantinople lived with pride and fear. They called themselves Romans, heirs of greatness, yet they watched as their empire shrank, province by province, century by century. The world around them changed, but they clung to their identity, believing they could outlast time itself. For centuries, they succeeded. While kingdoms rose and fell in the West, while Europe stumbled into the Dark Ages, Constantinople shone as a beacon of learning, trade, and culture. It was a jewel in a darkened world, proof that Rome was not entirely dead. But even jewels crack under pressure. New enemies rose: the Bulgars, the Seljuk Turks, and eventually the Crusaders, who came as allies but turned into conquerors. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusade, Constantinople was betrayed by fellow Christians, its treasures stolen, its churches desecrated. The empire never fully recovered from that wound. Though the Byzantines reclaimed their city decades later, the strength was gone. The empire was now a shadow of its former self, surviving more on memory than power. Its enemies closed in from every side, waiting for the moment to strike the final blow. Still, Constantinople stood, proud and unbroken, for centuries more. Its people clung to their Roman name, their faith, and their city. But time does not forgive even the greatest empires. The West had already fallen. The East's turn was coming. The greatest threat came from the rising power of the Ottoman Turks. Strong, relentless, and determined, they advanced ever closer to Constantinople. The city's walls had saved it for centuries, but even the strongest walls cannot hold forever. By the 15th century, the Eastern Roman Empire was reduced to little more than Constantinople itself. The empire that had once ruled continents now clung to a single city. The final act of Rome's story was about to be written, not in Latin, but in Greek, and not by Romans, but by Ottomans. The East had survived 1,000 years longer than the West, but survival was not eternity. The fall was coming, a fall that would echo as loudly as 476 CE. And when Constantinople fell, the last light of Rome would go out, leaving the world forever changed. The last light, the fall of Constantinople 1453. For 1,000 years after the West collapsed, Constantinople had endured. Its walls had turned back Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and even Crusaders. It had stood as the last beacon of Rome in a world that had forgotten the empire's glory. But in 1453, the final storm arrived. The Ottomans, a rising power, marched on the city with fire, steel, and a weapon the world had never seen before. The Emperor of Constantinople was Constantine, the last to wear the crown of Rome. He was not ruling over a vast empire. Only a city and a handful of lands remained. Yet he carried the weight of history on his shoulders. He knew the walls of Constantinople had saved Rome for centuries. He also knew this time might be different. From the east came Sultan Mehmed II, young, ambitious, and relentless. He was only 21 years old, but his vision was clear: to take Constantinople and end the empire once and for all. To him, the city was not just a prize, it was destiny. He brought with him an army of more than 80,000 soldiers, and with them, a weapon that would change warfare forever: massive cannons that could shatter stone. As the Ottoman army encircled the city, Constantinople prepared for its final stand. Its walls were legendary, triple layers of stone and towers that had never been breached. But the defenders were few. Perhaps only 7,000 men stood inside, facing an enemy more than 10 times their number. Courage was their shield, but courage cannot stop steel forever. The cannons began their thunder. For weeks, they roared, pounding the ancient walls day and night. Stones that had withstood centuries cracked and crumbled under the relentless fire. Dust filled the air, towers collapsed, and the ground trembled as if the earth itself mourned. The walls that had saved Rome so many times were breaking. Inside the city, fear and faith clashed. Priests led processions, carrying holy relics, praying for a miracle. Citizens gathered in Hagia Sophia, the great church of Justinian, seeking hope beneath its golden dome. But outside, the thunder of cannons drowned out prayers. The miracle they begged for did not come. The siege dragged on, and food grew scarce. Hunger gnawed at defenders, but still they fought. Night after night, they repelled Ottoman assaults, pushing back ladders, raining arrows, and holding the line. For a moment, it seemed the old Roman spirit had returned. But time was running out, and the Ottomans pressed harder. Sultan Mehmed was relentless. He ordered ships dragged across land to bypass the city's chain defenses in the harbor, a feat of sheer determination. When Constantinople awoke to see Ottoman ships inside the Golden Horn, morale shattered. The city was surrounded on all sides, trapped in a tightening noose. Emperor Constantine refused to surrender. He knew his empire was dying, but he would not die a coward. "The city is entrusted to me," he told his people. "I shall die with it." He donned armor, took up his sword, and prepared for the final battle. In that moment, he became less a ruler and more a symbol, the last Roman emperor, standing against the storm. On May 29, 1453, the final assault began. Before dawn, the Ottomans launched wave after wave against the shattered walls. Defenders fought desperately, but exhaustion and numbers overwhelmed them. Blood ran across the stones, screams filled the air, and centuries of Roman pride crumbled with every strike. In the chaos, Emperor Constantine vanished into the fighting. Some say he was cut down in the breach, fighting like a soldier until the end. Others believe he cast off his imperial robes to fight as a common man, his body never found. In death, he became legend, the emperor who refused to flee, who chose to die with Rome. The Ottomans surged into the city. Streets filled with fire, palaces looted, churches desecrated. Hagia Sophia, the greatest church of Christendom, was stormed, its golden mosaics gazed upon by new conquerors. The people who had prayed for deliverance now cried out in terror as the last Roman city was consumed. The fall of Constantinople echoed like thunder across the world. To Europe, it was a nightmare, the last fortress of Rome, gone forever. To the Ottomans, it was triumph, the birth of an empire that would rule for centuries. To history, it was the end of one age and the beginning of another. The Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, was no more. From the days of Augustus to the reign of Constantine, Rome had lasted nearly 1,500 years. Now it was gone. The empire that had called itself eternal had finally died, its crown taken by a new power rising from the east. And yet, even in death, Rome lived on. Its law, its architecture, its memory, all survived. The Renaissance, already stirring in Europe, drew strength from the scholars who fled Constantinople with ancient manuscripts. Rome's fall became the spark for Europe's rebirth. Out of tragedy, new light emerged. The Ottomans transformed Constantinople into Istanbul, their capital, but the ghosts of Rome never left. Its walls still stood, its streets still whispered of emperors, its domes still reached for heaven. The city changed, but its history remained carved into stone. For centuries, rulers would call themselves heirs of Rome. Charlemagne, the Tsars of Russia, even modern empires would claim the legacy. Rome had fallen, but the dream of Rome never died. Perhaps that is why it is remembered not only as an empire, but as an idea, eternal, even when its cities burned. The story that began with Romulus and Remus, with a city of 7 hills, ended with Constantine falling in battle. From hut to empire, from glory to ruin, the cycle had completed. Rome had risen, ruled the world, and fallen into ash. Yet in memory, it remained immortal. The fall of Constantinople was more than the death of a city. It was the end of the ancient world. From that moment forward, history turned a page. The Middle Ages ended, the modern age began, and Rome, though gone, became the foundation of everything that followed. Thus ended the story of the Roman Empire. Born in blood, crowned in glory, consumed by corruption, and destroyed by enemies, it lasted longer than any empire before or since. Its fall was not the end of history, but the beginning of our world. Rome may be gone, but Rome is everywhere in our laws, our cities, our languages, our dreams. And perhaps that is why, though it fell, it was never truly lost.